We have never encountered alien life, but to the Aztecs, the coming of the Spaniards was like aliens landing on Earth. Spain had arrived on the shores of the Aztec Empire in 1519 with an army ready to conquer the obviously weaker and primitive army of the Aztecs. The Spanish were seen as gods by the natives and easily defeated the Aztecs with powerful guns and impenetrable armor. This is the story we learned in history books, but this story is propaganda. The Spanish did not come to invade. The Spanish were not seen as gods by the Native Americans, and the Spanish were not defeated with superior weapons. This propaganda came about for three main reasons. 1. Because the Spanish needed to look strong to the world. 2. Because it truly believed their Christian people to be superior to the polytheistic Aztecs. And 3. Because the Aztecs and the Spanish did not truly understand the country they were at war with. But before we can start talking about the war, we need to look at the two contrasting empires that are about to clash. On one hand are the Aztecs. They ruled indirectly over a large empire, most of which consisted of tributary states. They had alienated their own subjects through their own brutality. It was rarely a matter of if a city will rebel, but when a city will rebel. The Aztecs were likely close to collapse from the endless rebellions, like many empires before them in Mesoamerica. Spain, on the other hand, saw great potential in their new American colonies. They had discovered the Americas less than 30 years ago and had set up various colonies. But the Spanish crown didn't invest a lot into these new colonies. Instead, they gave permits to people to conquer these lands, but they would have to fund such wars themselves, meaning that the people who established the first colonies were mostly ruthless businessmen or common people joining such an expedition to get a share of the profit. There was no real Spanish army in the Americas yet, and this meant that the Spanish conquerors, known as conquistadors, couldn't win in open battle. In fact, they would often have to ally with other tribes, using their limited yet advanced weapons to impress and intimidate natives into submission, while the native allies served as their army. But not all Spanish people are brutal conquerors. Some were traders who saw great value in selling cheap European products for the new resources the Americas had to offer. On one of these expeditions, they heard from the local Mayans of a land overflowing with gold somewhere northwest of the Mayan civilization. When this expedition returned to Cuba, the governor of Cuba began seeing dollar signs in his eyes. The governor had just conquered Cuba, and let's be honest, Cuba didn't sound nearly as profitable as the land of gold. But he needed permission from the crown first in order to conquer this land, so he sent a request to Spain asking permission from the King of Spain to conquer this land of gold. But he also needed information about this new land before he could conquer it. So he sent his trusted brother-in-law, a man named Hernán Cortés, on an expedition of trade and exploration. He made Cortés sign an agreement that he wouldn't conquer the land of gold. But Hernán Cortés followed the 61st rule of acquisition. The riskier the road, the greater the profit. He realized that whoever will conquer this land would likely be assigned by the king to rule it. And in a society where gold is your currency, conquering a land that was apparently overflowing with gold was too good of a prize. So Cortés secretly decided to conquer it for himself. And so Cortés set sail with 11 ships, carrying 630 people. But most of them were not warriors. In fact, most of them had never even been near a real battlefield. He only had a few hundred native Arawak warriors from Cuba, 30 crossbowmen, and 12 arquebusiers. But this is the army Cortés would use to conquer the Aztec Empire. But to rule over people, you need to speak with them. So Cortés went looking for some translators. And he found exactly what he was looking for. Just 8 years before, a Spanish expedition got shipwrecked in Mayan territory. They were captured by the Mayans, forced to work as slaves, eventually rose up to become war chiefs of a different tribe, married Mayan women, had the first half-European, half-Mayan child, and would eventually fight against the Spanish when they would try to conquer the Mayans. Their lives is basically already a pre-made Hollywood movie. But some of them decided to join Cortez's expedition. They were able to translate from Spanish to Mayan. Then, he also got a Mayan slave woman who could translate between Mayan and the Aztec language. She would eventually learn Spanish and become Cortez's wife and chief translator in Mesoamerica. Now that he would be able to speak to the Aztecs, it was time to head to the Aztecs. And so Hernando Cortez made it to the Aztec Empire. He founded a town and then headed north to the Totonac Confederacy. They had been conquered by the Aztecs over 50 years ago and were taxed heavily by their Aztec overlords. He met with their leaders, and before long, the Totonac Confederacy had joined the Spanish cause and were in open rebellion. During their meetings, the Totonacs gave Cortez golden jewelry, reinforcing the false notion that the Aztec Empire was a land of gold. And Cortez took several Aztec tax collectors as prisoners and offered them as gifts to the Totonacs. But here is an interesting question. Cortez, at most, had a few hundred people with him. Why did so many vassals of the Aztecs want to join the Spanish cause in this early stage, when he only had a few hundred people? Well, there is a common myth that the natives thought the Aztecs were gods or godlike. But the only evidence for this comes from the Spanish. Of course, people with pale skin and shiny metal armor, horses and leather, guns and cannons, they certainly gave the Spanish a certain stature amongst the natives who had never seen such a thing. But they weren't stupid. They didn't actually think the Spanish were gods. In fact, whenever there isn't a source to counter that of the Spanish, such as during private meetings, the Spanish would often claim that the Aztecs were completely willing to subjugate themselves to the Spanish Empire, of course. Now, one common theme of the Aztec history is war, death, and blood. In fact, this is common in most Mesoamerican cultures. The Totonac Confederacy practiced human sacrifices themselves and were no strangers to war. So having witnessed all you've seen so far, let me ask you, do you think they would just give up without a fight? Would they capitulate simply because someone in shiny clothing walked up to them? The Totonac Confederacy didn't join the Spanish because they thought they were in divine presence. They joined the Spanish to get the hell away from the brutal Aztec Empire. And it's at this point that Emperor Moctezuma II started paying attention to the Spaniards who had landed on his shores. The emperor was aware of the Spanish landing on his shores almost immediately. He had sent some ambassadors to Cortez, who had witnessed the firepower of guns and cannons. But the emperor was a busy man, and this was just one of several problems he had to deal with. But now that became a different story. Now Cortez had taken away one of his tributary states. This was troubling. Cortez had decided to head straight for the Aztec capital. Not necessarily to start a war, it was probably too early for that as he didn't have the manpower yet, but he did want to see the city for himself before he'd conquer the empire. Soon, Cortez's expedition arrived at the Tlaxcala Confederacy. They are this hole right here in the middle of the Aztec Empire. They were a confederacy of about 200 different towns and tribes, but without a central government. The location of this confederacy couldn't have been any better for Cortez. You see, it was located very close to where Cortez had landed, and reached almost all the way to Tenochtitlan itself. It was a bit curious why the Aztecs never conquered them. After all, they were so close and did not have a central government. This should be an easy victory. Many historians believe that the Aztecs kept the confederacy intact, so that they could always go there if they needed a quick victory or new captives. And they had imposed a full embargo on the confederacy to keep them in a relatively weak state. But when Cortez marched into Tlaxcala territory with an army of a supposedly Aztec tributary state, they were expecting another war. Cortez and his people were almost immediately attacked. Cortez used his cannons, guns, and horses to hold off the enemy. But soon the Tlaxcala had completely surrounded Cortez and his army. The Tlaxcala were embargoed and surrounded by the Aztecs. How could they know these people came from somewhere else? But after 3 days of battle, and Cortés sending desperate messages of peace, the Tlaxcala leader finally realized that they were not Aztec. And so he decided to meet this white man. Cortés convinced the Tlaxcala that his only goal was to conquer the Aztecs, and the Tlaxcala could become important subjects in this new empire Cortés wanted to forge. The Tlaxcala realized the Aztec would kill them all anyway at some point in the future, so if the option is between certain destruction with the Aztecs and possible survival with the Spanish, then the option is easy to make. And so Cortés had gained a second ally. And now Moctezuma II started treating Cortés seriously. He had sent ambassadors to Cortés to convince him to turn back. Later, Moctezuma would send gifts of silver and gold, trying to placate the Spanish. But all that did was convince them that the Aztecs must be extremely rich and so are worth conquering. Cortés would write back to his king of his successes and how easily he was able to extract gold from the Aztec Empire, all in an attempt to gain the Spanish king's favor. Now he continued his travel to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan and moved his army to the city of Cholula. Cholula was a religious city with few warriors protecting it. Instead, they put their faith in their gods and their prestige to keep them safe. Cortés, who didn't follow their gods, nor was he impressed by their prestige, decided to move to this city while on his way to Tenochtitlan. But instead of being greeted by the nobility, like before, they were greeted with little fanfare. And this is where the Aztec and Spanish chronicles differ from each other. The Spanish claimed that there was a plot to murder them in their sleep, and so the Spanish confronted their leader in the main temple, who admitted that they were ordered to resist the Spanish, but had not followed up on those orders. So Cortés captured the Cholulan leaders and set the temple on fire. Because of the layout of the city, most people who lived close to the temple were nobility. So most people who died in the fire were nobility, while most commoners managed to escape death. The Aztecs would claim that this was an unprovoked attack by the Spanish. They claimed that if there was some sort of plot, that it was all the fault of the local commander of the garrison. But regardless, thousands of people were killed, and the city was burned down. There was no denying it anymore. The Spanish were a force to be reckoned with. And from now on, no city would ignore the Spanish anymore, and even Emperor Moctezuma had to admit that his attempts to placate the Spanish with gifts of gold and silver had failed. So he sent a message to Cortés, inviting him and the Spaniards to Tenochtitlan and meet the Emperor himself. If you liked this episode, then please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. My next video will finish the Aztec series. So if you want to be notified when the last episode comes out, press the subscribe button and hit the notification bell.